And now we got to talk politics for a minute because Trump's getting a lot of flack for his latest appointment, his latest presidential selection, but I actually think it is phenomenal.
Another hire, Dr. Bhattacharya. He will be nominated to lead the National Institutes of Health. He is both a physician and an economist who has been a critic of COVID-era policies.
Public health has to return to its normal ways and apologize for the tremendous mistakes it made during the pandemic. A lot of people have lost confidence in public health as a consequence of its sort of embrace of policies that didn't work.
Trump has tapped the Stanford Medical School professor and economist Jay Bhattacharya to head the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, under his administration. Bhattacharya emerged as a huge COVID skeptic in terms of COVID mandates and lockdowns, and then was targeted pretty viciously by the scientific establishment and by big tech through censorship, suppression efforts, and just an attempt to discredit him. But a lot of his ideas have aged remarkably well, and I think he's an excellent selection. I've met Jay a couple times and am friendly with him, but that's certainly not why I'm supporting him as NIH director. One of the reasons I really like him as a selection is that, yes, he is an eminently qualified medical expert, a Stanford-trained doctor and professor with tons of published academic research and articles and long curriculum vitae. But he's also a trained economist, which I think is really cool and really important, because what happened during COVID was so many of our health officials, like Dr. Fauci, even when they were doing their best, even when they weren't getting up to some of the malicious shenanigans that I've spoken up in the past about, were only viewing their policies like lockdowns and mask mandates and school closures through the lens of health. They weren't considering, and even then, just public health in terms of COVID. They weren't considering all the other factors: mental health, unemployment, economic learning loss, and the lifetime economic impacts of that it will have, the school closure generation will have throughout their lifetimes. All these things. That's exactly what economists are trained to do, to weigh trade-offs, to look at opportunity costs and benefits across everything. And pairing that with medical expertise and medical knowledge gives you, I think, a much better vantage point from which to view public health policies in the true sense of considering both the public in all its forms and all of health, not just one disease and its impact. Here's a clip of Jay testifying before Congress to give you a sense of who he is and what he believes.
Public health bureaucrats operate more like dictators than scientists during the pandemic, sealing themselves off from credible outside criticism. Consider, for instance, the treatment of scientific dissidents outside the government who contradicted public health dogma. In the earliest days of the pandemic, public health bureaucrats organized a cover-up of the hypothesis that COVID emerged as a result of a laboratory leak, calling scientists who proposed the idea conspiracy theorists. Only recently have official bodies started to admit the hypothesis is plausible and maybe even true, and certainly not a conspiracy. Where do the scientists whose careers were destroyed advancing the idea go to get their reputations back? When Martin Kulldorff of Harvard University here today, Sunetra Gupta, a professor at Oxford University, and I proposed a focused protection alternative, not a herd immunity alternative, to lockdowns in October 2020, then NIH director Francis Collins labeled the three of us fringe epidemiologists and engaged a media campaign to take down our proposal, to which tens of thousands of doctors, epidemiologists, and scientists endorsed, including a Nobel Prize winner. Under the banner of combating misinformation, government health agencies use their power to collaborate with social media companies to control the public conversation about science, COVID science, and policy. The pattern repeated itself throughout the pandemic, with science bureaucrats abusing their authority to create an illusion of scientific consensus in favor of destructive ideas when none existed.
Now, Jay became infamous because he participated in something called the Great Barrington Declaration, a group of skeptics of the establishment narrative, including medical experts and economists like Jay, who put out a resolution essentially during the pandemic early on, saying that lockdowns and massive societal mandates were a mistake, and that what we should do instead is look at the approach of, for example, Sweden, and protect the most vulnerable people, isolate them, and get them the materials they need to be safe, the elderly, the immunocompromised, but then allow everyone else to largely go about business as usual. And if they get infected, eventually a large amount of them will develop natural immunity, and you may have some form of herd immunity, a phenomenon we've seen with many diseases in the past. This declaration and this statement of principles was viciously attacked, including by lead doctors and scientists within the federal government, as fringe and as dangerous and radical. But while every piece of it hasn't worked out perfectly, it's aged pretty well, all things considered. When you think about how massively the lockdowns failed, everyone still got COVID 10 times over anyway, and how they caused massive mental health and economic harms that are just devastating and irreparable in so many ways. So as you can see, I find Jay Bhattacharya an incredibly remarkable candidate for this position, and I think he's a great selection. But his appointment did not go over well with the left. CNN medical analyst Jonathan Reiner tweeted, "Dr. Jay Bhattacharya is Trump's pick for director of NIH. During COVID, he advocated to let the virus spread widely so the US would get to herd immunity faster. His plan would have killed many more Americans. He also thought COVID might only kill 40,000 people. He was off by 1.2 million." So there's a lot wrong with this tweet. First, it's kind of a caricature of Bhattacharya's views and of the Great Barrington Declaration. They didn't just want everyone to get COVID, they wanted to protect the vulnerable, but then let the not vulnerable go about their lives. And yes, they did discuss the possibility of herd immunity, which I don't think really worked out because COVID kept rapidly evolving and there were new strains and other things, but you do get into some complicated science there that I can't really speak to. But I think it's totally false, or at least unknowable, to say his plan would have killed more Americans, because when you consider all the Americans who died from the second and third order effects of the lockdowns, things like skyrocketing drug overdoses due to mental health and depressive issues and all that, and the number of people who all got sick and died of COVID anyway, despite these draconian measures we took, I mean, you don't know that his approach would have led to a higher death count. If anything, it might have done the opposite. And so you can't actually make that claim with certainty at all. I also wanted to know about this claim that this doctor, the CNN medical analyst, alleges that Jay said only 20,000 people or only 40,000 people would die of COVID. Where does that come from? Did Jay really say that? Well, I tracked down the source for this claim, and guess what? Spoiler alert, that's not what Dr. Bhattacharya said. In a Wall Street Journal op-ed published at the very, very beginning of the pandemic, Jay Bhattacharya wrote about the uncertainty about what we didn't know about the virus and said it could end up being an epidemic that kills anywhere between 20,000 and 2 million. So he just made a vague statement when we didn't know much about the virus that said, this could go one of a few ways. It could end up being a relatively small virus that kills tens of thousands, or it could kill millions. He did not say this will only kill 40,000 people and then was proven wrong. That's not what happened. But of course, who's to let the truth get in the way of a partisan cheap shot? The left-wing political commentator Mehdi Hasan made a similar criticism of Trump's pick. Here, he tweeted, "A disaster for America and for public health, and a reward for a man who was consistently, demonstrably wrong about the pandemic and when it would end and how many would die." So Mehdi is somebody who I follow closely because I think he's a powerful speaker and good debater, and occasionally makes interesting points, but I consider him wrong about almost everything. But I do like to follow people from across the spectrum, even ones who disagree with me or whose views I find profoundly unsettling on some fronts. Here, I just totally disagree. I don't think that Jay Bhattacharya will be a disaster for public health. I think he's a very serious and competent guy who will do a great job. And maybe he was wrong about a few things during the pandemic, but I think the thrust of his analysis aged remarkably well. And everyone was wrong about at least something. Every expert under the sun got something wrong during the pandemic. There was so much uncertainty. And the people that Mehdi Hasan continues to valorize, like Dr. Anthony Fauci, got so many things wrong time and time again. And also, knowingly or not, I think perhaps knowingly in his case, misled and lied about a number of things as well. This has all been extensively documented about Dr. Fauci, but those people are still venerated and celebrated by the left. So even if Jay Bhattacharya had gotten a couple things wrong about the pandemic, which I'm not sure he did, but say he had, that wouldn't be disqualifying by their own analysis, because they still venerate the Dr. Fauci's and Robert Redfield's and other pandemic era expert members of the government who did get so much wrong. So yeah, I think he's an excellent selection, and Trump should pick more people like Jay Bhattacharya for his administration.